Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Buenaflor from the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on working with your board to develop a policy plan. This webinar is part of our 2013 monthly nonprofit advocacy webinar series. I'd like to mention a couple of things before we get started. First, you should see a slide on your computer screen with the title of today's webinar. If you don't, or if you have any problems at all, please dial Start Meeting's toll-free support line directly for assistance. The number is 800-644-9070. Again, that number is 800-644-9070. That number should also be listed in the instructional email that was sent to you yesterday. In order to ensure good sound quality and eliminate background noise, we have muted the phone lines. You can hear us, but we can't hear you. However, we do want you to ask questions. The way to do that is by using the chat box on the right side of your screen. You can choose to have your questions seen by just the presenter or by all participants by selecting which recipient gets the message. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat box at any point during the webinar. We'll also set aside some time at the end for questions. After today, we'll send a follow-up email with a link to watch the webinar recording on our YouTube channel. Now, next month, our topic will be fundraising for advocacy, and in October, we'll take a look at evaluating advocacy. Please feel free to register online for any of these free sessions. Now, let me turn things over to MCN's Public Policy Director, Susie Brown.
Good morning. Thanks, Mark, and welcome everybody to this webinar. First, I'd like to just remind people of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits' role in public policy. In addition to doing advocacy in a variety of ways, we support individual nonprofits and Minnesota's nonprofit sector to be their own voice in the public policy process. To do so, we provide training on advocacy and lobbying and serve as a resource to policymakers on the nonprofit sector, advocating on issues that impact all nonprofits, such as incentives to charitable giving, nonprofit tax exemptions, lobbying rights, and election activity. We hope that this webinar series is a useful training opportunity and information source for you and your nonprofit, and we welcome you today. This series, as Mark mentioned, has 3 more events after today, including fundraising for advocacy, evaluating advocacy, and building strategic relationships with elected officials. We hope you find today's topic useful and join us for those in the future. Today's topic will be working with your board of directors to develop a policy plan. I will be presenting today with my colleague Amy Brew. We have both been in both staff and board roles in developing public policy for nonprofits. Currently, I'm in the staff role at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits as Public Policy Director, and Amy is a member of the MCN Board of Directors and also operates Amy Brew Consulting. So we will be your resources today, and we invite you to follow up with us after today's event if you'd like further information or have questions. We'd like to structure today's webinar around 3 learning objectives. We hope you find these useful and find the content to be relevant to these learning objectives. The first is that you will understand the role of the Board of Directors in developing a policy plan. Second, we hope that you will learn about how boards might structure themselves in order to best participate in policy planning. And third, we will explore and hope that you will understand through this process some of the common concerns in working with boards of directors in policy planning. As Mark mentioned, we invite your questions either during the webinar or at the end. If they come in during the webinar, we'll watch those and may interrupt the presentation with a relevant question or save them to the end, but we welcome you to send them in as they come to you. Okay, we will start with the first learning objective, which is understanding the role of the Board of Directors in developing a policy plan, and Amy will lead this discussion.
All right, thank you, Susie. Good morning, everyone. Like Susie said, I'm Amy Brew, and I'm really pleased to be joining Susie on this webinar to talk about how we can work with our boards to develop a policy plan. The first objective we're going to talk about this morning is how we can work with our boards, whether we're the board member or the staff person, on their role in developing a policy plan for their nonprofit organization. We're going to talk a little bit about what a policy plan is, what considerations the nonprofit might consider for determining the board's role, what assets the board brings to this process and to developing the policy plan, and then what information the board might need to do their best work with the policy plan. So first, let's talk a little bit about what a policy plan is. We've given some examples here. A policy plan could take the shape of whatever works for each nonprofit organization. Some examples we've provided: agenda setting or taking positions on issues. Obviously, as leaders in the nonprofit sector, we want organizations to set an agenda that works to advance their mission and to take positions on issues that may benefit their clients, those who they serve. A policy plan may help an organization define strategies and tactics, both for the organization as a whole, but also for the board. Maybe the board wants to figure out what their work would be and how they would strategize around that, and then what their actions would be for their policy plan. A policy plan could also help a nonprofit organization identify how to staff that work, what resources might be available, and how to plan for that work for the long term, not just the short term. So let's talk a little bit about the board's role in a policy plan. And as I said, this really depends on the nonprofit organization. Every organization has a different kind of board, maybe a working board, maybe a very high-level board. Organizations can consider several things when they're figuring out what would work best for their policy plan. Okay, so as we said, a board may want to focus on taking positions on issues or setting an agenda to be a leader in whatever their field is. Would the board want to have discussion and then approve an organization's position on a specific issue or a part of a legislative agenda or a federal congressional agenda? Again, it depends on the organization. It is an appropriate and desirable governance function for many nonprofit boards to take the lead on some issues and to not just set the agenda for their organization, but sometimes for their field as well. As we've said, nonprofit boards can also have a role in defining the strategies and then the actions for how they would lead the policy work. So as I said before, maybe a working board would be much more involved. Maybe board members would have deep connections to a community, or maybe are doing a lot of the volunteer work and would do some of that work that would help them to, okay, I'm going to just make sure that you guys can see the slides because I'm looking at what you guys are looking at. And I want to make sure if you can't see the slides.
If you are unable to see the slides right now, please let us know in the chat box. One moment, please. We'll have them up shortly.
And while Mark is working on the technical issues, I'm going to continue. I know you all got the slides in your email, so take a look at those if you're not able to see the slides via the webinar. Again, please let us know whether or not you can see the slides via the chat box. Like I said, I'm going to continue with the webinar content while we figure out some of our technical issues. Okay, so what I was talking about is how a working board, where volunteers may have deep connections in the community or may be doing volunteer work related to policy and advocacy, they may have a slightly different role in defining strategies and tactics. Did I get the heads up that the participants can see the content? Mm-hmm. Great, so follow along with me. The next thing that I'm going to talk a little bit about is how the board may have a role in identifying staffing needs or resources that might be available to do the policy work. So perhaps the board would be involved in a very high-level strategic discussion. Maybe the board would be a part of defining if the organization would hire a policy director, or would staff the work with more advocacy and organizing skilled people. The board may have a role in that for nonprofits that are getting up and running with their policy and advocacy work. The board may also, in its governance and fiduciary oversight responsibilities, have a role in approving a staffing plan that has budget implications. And just one note that I want to make related to that, this is an example of where a policy plan for a board of directors is directly connected to the board's overall fiduciary and governance oversight responsibilities. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. And like Susie said, please let us know if you have questions as we're going through the slides. The next slide is to consider the board's assets. And again, this slide would apply to boards of directors in different ways. So for example, do board members have a unique knowledge of the issues? Do you have expertise on your board, and that's how they, for example, got recruited to be on the board? Do they have information that maybe would inform the policy plan? Do they have expertise around the policy issues? Do they have connections to decision makers or those who may be in lead roles in the legislature or whatever policy oversight the issues of your organization may be involved with? Do board members have access to resources to do this work? Can they bring specific fundraising to do your policy and advocacy work? Have they been involved some way in generating resources for policy work? Perhaps they are a funder themselves, and you've gotten them recruited onto your board, and they can help you to figure out the best ways to resource the policy work of your organization. So the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about what the board might need to know about the policy plan. And I'll talk about some examples that we've come up with, but one of the first things that you could do, obviously, is query your board, or if you're a board member, to talk with your other board members who may be most interested in some leadership on policy work about what they would most want to know in creating and then advancing a policy plan. So what information might be best for them to be ambassadors for the organization, and again, taking it back to their governance role and their ambassador role in the community, how they can best help to advance the mission of the nonprofit. Are there specific issues that the board would be most interested in that specifically advance the mission of the organization? What are the arguments that the community or the legislature, policymakers, advocates bring in favor of the issues, and importantly, against the issues? We always say that it's important for us to know our opposition as well as our partners and collaborators, and how you would make sure that your board is aware of that as they're taking positions on issues or advancing a policy plan is very important. Is the organization going to be working with other partners in the community? And how can you make sure that the board is educated about how you might be aligned with other organizations is very important. Whether you're formally signing on to a coalition or you have informal partnerships, working with others who are leaders on whatever the policy issue is that you're most interested in advancing are important for the board to be aware of. Strategically, what is the best way to get what you want out of doing policy work and getting to what would most advance your mission? And what are the ways to get there are important things that you can help your board understand. The next slide that we're going to talk about is going to move us into objective number 2. So again, please let us know if you have any questions about the slides that refer to objective number 1. Objective number 2 is where we're going to learn about how boards may structure themselves to best participate in this policy planning work. And I'm going to turn the slides back over to Susie.
Thanks, Amy. So we thought it would be useful to think with you about the different ways that you might put together structures that will help your board of directors have conversations in a way that makes sense for your organization. It is really important in some of these complicated conversations that are strategic and talking about complex issues and maybe opposition to get the right kind of structure and process in place. So I'd like to name 4 possible structures that you could think about in your organization. Certainly this is not an exhaustive list. There might be something else that makes better sense to your organization, but these are the kinds of structures that would typically be used for board of directors in their policy planning. And I'll describe each of these individually, but they include using your full board, using a policy committee, using an advisory committee, or a temporary committee, and the purposes and ways that each of these may be used. First of all, we'll talk about using the full board for your policy discussions. Before we do that, I'd like to just highlight the fact that whatever structure you plan to use is a full board question. So the first question your organization should ask itself is a question for the full board, which is, where are we going to have this conversation? And in some cases, the full board will decide that another smaller committee makes more sense, but that's really where that question should be asked. If the full board decides to do this together as a complete entity, it might do so for a variety of reasons. But largely, it may depend on how your board structures itself generally for its other governance work and whether it uses committees for the specific work of governance. It may be that a board is very small and a working board, and that group tends to do everything together already. It may be that boards are very large or have specific expertise that lends themselves to kind of compartmentalizing some of the work, and they do so already in committees. In that case, that makes sense for the organization. But using the full board is often the right place, whether you use committees or not, to have the final discussion and to have final approval of the things that would be considered governance or fiduciary responsibilities, one of which should be approval of a final policy plan that includes a legislative agenda and the positions that the organization might take on the issues, and the second would be approval of any plan that would have substantial financial implications for the organization, like establishing a new program, policy program, and raising money for that and spending money in certain ways, or shifting resources from one part of the organization to another. If a small group is determined to be the best way for the pre-work to happen, then it will be really important for the full board to determine what information they will need in order to do the final approval on the governance and fiduciary responsibilities. Next, we'll talk about using policy committees. Some nonprofit organizations establish standing policy committees in order to bring focus and consistent attention to this work. A standing policy committee would be very much like committees you probably already experience in your boards, like a finance committee, maybe a strategic planning committee, maybe an executive committee. Like other important committees on the board, the role of a policy committee really is to do pre-work. The pre-work will set the full board up for final success. Policy committees could include members of the board who are particularly interested in policy or have knowledge or relationships or expertise to lend, or it could be people who are interested in learning more and want to use a policy committee process as a way to gain that knowledge. Policy committees of the board should clearly establish their authority, if they have any, to act on behalf of the entire organization. Often committees make recommendations to full boards, and the full boards have the final authority. Although in the case of policy committees, sometimes establishing limited authority will help the organization if the organization is faced with unexpectedly short timelines or policy questions that require rapid response. So a policy committee could be set up in a way that largely informs the board and does the pre-work for the general governance role, but it could also be set up to have rapid response authority in case there's some sort of late-breaking or unexpected decision that needs to happen on the short term. Policy committees of the board, just like any other committee, can be a standing committee or an ad hoc committee. A standing committee would be one that establishes that they have regular work year-round in a periodic way, maybe monthly or quarterly or twice a year, and they will meet and do their work in that consistent way. An ad hoc committee would be one that would be designed and set up to be put to use when there's a specific need. An advisory committee can look very similar to a policy committee in many ways, although typically this would make use of the knowledge of people outside of the board of directors. An advisory committee could be comprised of any group of people your organization finds useful. Typically, it would include the board, some members of the board, but it might include external experts, people who are affected by the policies that you're talking about, maybe your constituency, maybe policymakers themselves or former policymakers who understand how this process works and can advise about strategies and tactics, maybe researchers who have knowledge and data that will inform your opinion, and maybe people who have diverse political perspectives. We will carry out this work in an environment where we have diverse political perspectives, and inviting that into our board, into our advisory committee conversations can help us understand what the different points of view are on an issue. If you establish an advisory committee, it should have a clear scope of duties and decision-making authority. Often a policy committee would be considered one that advises the board of directors, and that might be slightly different than a policy committee that's directly made up of board members, and that the policy committee would make formal recommendations to the board of directors to adopt a certain stance or a plan. The advisory committee would provide information and advice to the board of directors for them to consider for their governance role. Like a policy committee, an advisory committee could be set up as either a standing committee that meets regularly or an ad hoc committee that's put to use as needed. A final example I'll offer of a policy committee would be a temporary committee. If your organization doesn't have a policy committee or an advisory committee, or maybe any particular structure or process for the full board to engage in a public policy planning discussion, you might think about utilizing a temporary committee to be able to consider policies and strategies and do any pre-work that will be necessary for the board to set up a process and a plan for themselves. Like an advisory committee, a temporary committee could be made up of board members, staff, or any group that the organization finds useful to inform their work. Similarly, a temporary committee should establish a clear scope of duties and decision-making authority and should consider themselves advisors to the organization. And a temporary committee is one, unlike the other two, that is ready to disband when the work is over. We thank them for their service and they move on. I'll give a quick example of how an organization might use a temporary committee in case there's a little fuzziness between temporary and advisory. It may be that an organization is at the very early stages of considering getting involved in public policy work. They don't know what issues they're going to take on. They don't know who's interested, what coalition members they might be a part of. They don't know what kind of structure or process they should use for their board. It would be a perfectly great opportunity for the organization to grab a group of board members, some staff members, some people they serve, and some people in the community who might understand this work, bring them together and think in the very early stages about how this organization might set up their policy work. And one of the results of that temporary committee could be a recommendation that the board set up a public policy committee, which is where this work will happen. Amy, did you have an example for this as well?
So I'm going to give just a little bit of an example about how a temporary committee could turn into a public policy committee, related to what Susie was just saying. And I'm going to use an example that demonstrates how a board can advocate for an issue, what the structure they might use to advocate for that issue, and then the process for how to do so. So I'm going to use the temporary committee example that Susie just gave to then talk a little bit more about how a board could use a policy committee to advance an issue. So the issue that I'm going to use as the example is increasing revenues at the state legislative level. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Minnesota Council on Nonprofits Board played a leadership role, and then talk about how that led to a policy committee in a board that I was involved with, who took that leadership that MCN started and then carried that through with their policy committee. So the Minnesota Council on Nonprofits has been a longtime leader in demonstrating how, through the Minnesota Budget Project and otherwise, how the increasing of revenues at the state legislative level can help nonprofits advance their missions. And so that long history was there for the Council on Nonprofits, and then the Council on Nonprofits naturally then took a board position to support increasing tax revenues at the state legislative level. So the way then that translated for a policy committee at another nonprofit that I'm just going to talk a little bit about, the policy committee at that nonprofit was a standing committee. It went on in perpetuity, so it wasn't a temporary committee. And that committee was exercised in taking positions on issues, but very specific issues to the specific mission of the organization. The Public Policy Committee was board-led, so had a board co-chair, but also had external community members. So the reason I'm using that example for the structure and then also the process was how then it led to the full board vote of increasing revenues at the state legislative level, to advocate for increasing tax revenues at the state legislative level. So that policy committee really dug into the issues. Staff helped the policy committee members understand how a proposal to increase tax revenues could really benefit the clients that that nonprofit organization saw, to see how increasing tax revenues could lead to future investments into program success. And the policy committee really dug into looking at who the partners were, who would oppose that and what that would mean for the board. Really thought a bit about what it might mean if the board felt like it looked too political to take a position on a controversial legislative issue. But in the end, the policy committee did the analysis that helped then make that recommendation to the full board. And again, I wanted to just talk a little bit about an issue and then the structure through a policy committee that was a standing ongoing committee, and then the process for how the policy committee really dug into the issue and then made the recommendation to the full board. And then that takes us back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of the slides in Objective 1, where the full board may exercise its leadership by setting an agenda or taking positions on issues. So I'm going to turn it back over to Susie. She's going to finish up here as we're talking about the way that a board can structure themselves to participate in policy planning. And then we're going to move on to Objective 3.
And before we do so, there's a question from Joan, and again, please send in your questions if you have them about committee structures. The question from Joan is to provide examples of the role, authority, and responsibilities of a policy committee. So this would be a policy committee of the board. An example would be, you could define it like this. The role of the policy committee is to advise the board after doing pre-work, which includes consideration of the positions that the organization will take on certain issues. So if an issue comes to the organization doesn't know what to do with it, they can give this issue to the policy committee and establish that their role is to do the work necessary, and I'll get to responsibilities about what that looks like in a second, but to do the work necessary so that this committee can make a recommendation to the board of directors about whether they would support or oppose this position. The authority of this committee is really none. It really would be to make a recommendation, that's their role, but there is no specific authority given to this committee to make the final determination for the board of directors. You could change that if you wanted to and give this committee full authority for final decision making, but typically boards of directors have committees that make recommendations and full boards have final approval. The responsibilities of this committee in order to advise the board would be things like this. Consider both sides of the issue. Bring in people to their meetings who represent a diverse range of views and information about the issue. Determine what value it would be to this issue to have your organization sign on or join the effort. Consider the risks that the organization might take in signing on to this issue. Present a fully informed position with consideration of strategies, values, risk, and context to the board of directors. So really this policy committee could have a lot of interesting work, really digging into the issue, really thinking about it, doing a lot of outside work and research that allows them to present a fully formed, thoughtful, and strategic recommendation to the board of directors for their final approval. I hope that helps, Joan. The next thing we'll do is move on to exploring common concerns among boards. We hope that this is a useful third objective in our presentation today. First of all, and so there are three common concerns that we'll talk about. One is general hesitation. The second is organizational risk management. And the third is the reality that we have diverse personal views about politics and policy on our boards. I will talk about the general hesitation first, and I want to just start by saying that being generally hesitant is a really natural and common starting place for boards of directors, and that's fine. But we have a job to be able to figure out how to identify what causes the general hesitation and see if there are ways that we can educate or have conversations about that in order to move past general hesitation to action. The first thing that we hear most often are related to issues around 501c3 organizations and lobbying. And as you'll see in the first bullet point, a common starting place for boards of directors is that nonprofits can't lobby, and actually they can. I'm sure many of you who are on this webinar know that, but understanding that that's a starting point for many board members is important so we can engage in the right conversation. Another area of general concern is that nonprofits can't engage in what's commonly called political activity. The word political is often used generally in a variety of circumstances, but a lack of precision in using the word political actually can hinder us here. What we can't do as 501c3 nonprofits is electoral politics. We can't get involved in elections. And there are very specific rules, and we're largely very good at following them. But we can get involved in policy activity and the activities that help us move our organizations toward the policy changes and systems changes that support our mission and the people that we serve. The confusion here can be that often policy activity exists in a political context, and we think of it as politically charged activity, which it can be, but in fact, as we're thinking about how to move from hesitation to action, we need to really think about it as legitimate, allowable policy activity where our organizations have great opportunity to influence, and absolutely we can and must stay out of the formal political electoral process. We sometimes find that organizations understand that it's okay to lobby, but the board members might feel arm's length or more greatly distant than that from actual laws and understanding of how it works. And sometimes a board training, even though the board of directors isn't going to be the group that carries out this activity, a board training might help them understand how the staff and management will interface in this way and what kinds of activities they're doing. So, for example, the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits can come and provide a free board training to help your board members understand this is what it will look like for the staff members who are engaging in this work. These are the kinds of things you need to know about how they'll operate. Sometimes board members have general hesitation because they don't know what it looks like. They don't know what it means if you take a position on an issue. Does it mean you'll be sending a full-time staff person to the Capitol? Does it mean you'll be joining coalitions? Does it mean you'll be doing sit-ins on the Capitol steps? There are lots of organizational decisions to make about what that would look like and how you'd implement this work. But one of the ways that we can address this issue for boards that are hesitant is to give them examples of other nonprofits that are doing this work. One of the ways we can do that with boards would be, for example, to invite in a few coalition members on an issue that you're thinking about working on. You could invite 3 organizations, for example, that do this work in different ways. One that has a full-time lobbyist, one that uses a community organizer, one that does research on the issue. And they could illustrate and describe to your board of directors how every organization carries out this work in different ways. And it's really up to the organization to figure out what makes sense to them. And I'd like to just add in the final bullet point there, boards of directors should ask themselves, are there MCN resources that would be helpful? A substantial part of our job and my role is to help organizations move from this hesitation into a place where they can take action and be effective. So we have lots of resources available to you and hope that you make the most of them. I will shift now to Amy, who will talk about the next 2 areas that are common concerns for boards, including risk management and the reality of diverse personal views on our boards.
Okay, great. Thanks, Susie. Before I talk a little bit more about how the board needs to manage risk associated with the organization, I just want to ask again if anybody has questions. We loved getting that question from Joan. So if you have questions, go ahead and type them in, and we'd be happy to address them. Like Susie said, the next thing that we're going to move into is talking a little bit about how a board has an important role in managing risk associated with the nonprofit organization, and the perception, or sometimes reality, that doing policy work can bring risk to the organization. So sometimes, especially for organizations that are entering into policy and advocacy work for the first time, there may be some new risks associated with the organization. And Susie mentioned some of these. We can talk a little bit about them, about how the board can have a conversation about these risks, whether they are real or perceived by the board. So first, sometimes there's hesitancy around doing policy and advocacy work because the board might be afraid that a funding source either restricts doing that policy work, or that the association with doing policy and advocacy may not seem attractive to some of the organization's longtime funders. And that's an important conversation for the board to have. What's important to note is that organizations can do both. They can still fund their program work, and they can do policy and advocacy work. And for that matter, there's funding available to do that policy and advocacy work for nonprofits as well. Another risk that the board may need to consider, we talked about this a little bit when a board is taking a position on an issue, for example, that may seem somewhat controversial. So who might oppose that work? Who might oppose a nonprofit organization taking a position on an issue? Who may have the feeling that the nonprofit should just continue with its direct services work and that advocacy or policy work feels too political? That's an important thing for the board to consider and to educate its constituents and make sure to make a careful decision about when opposition is important to consider or where the board needs to go ahead and fully support that policy work. Susie talked about this a little bit when she was talking about electioneering, and so I just want to address some fears a nonprofit organization may have around risking its 501c3 status. So a 501c3 can do lobbying work, as Susie mentioned, but it does need to refrain from prohibited electioneering work. And like Susie mentioned, there are lots of resources to help a nonprofit understand how it can do its policy work and stay away from the electioneering work that a nonprofit is prohibited from doing, a 501c3 nonprofit is prohibited from doing. It's an important thing for the board maybe to get some education, get a training, like Susie said, on what is allowable for a 501c3 to do. Just to take a step back, I'm assuming that most people that are on this webinar are aware 501c3 is tax status, it's IRS code for nonprofit organizations. And that's why that is listed there, because it does mean that there are some restrictions on what nonprofits can do. It doesn't mean that we can't do policy work, though. We can and should. Perhaps taking a position on a controversial issue or making a big splash with a big lobby day at the state capitol, maybe the board is concerned that that might bring unwanted attention to the organization. Maybe they want the attention of the organization to stay focused on the very direct service work that the organization has been known for. Those are important issues for the board to think about and address, especially in their role as ambassadors to the community for their organization's mission, and in particular how they may be in a unique position as board members to manage the reputation of the organization, as they might be spokespeople and again as ambassadors in the community. We talked about this a little bit. So when may the nonprofit be perceived as doing political work? Is it appear political to do policy work? And we've already discussed that there are important rules for a nonprofit to follow to make sure that it does its lobbying work in the allowed legal limits, but that it refrains from doing electioneering work. And then the perception in the community that maybe a direct service organization is now doing work that's perceived as political is important for the board to address, but doesn't necessarily need to preclude that board from advancing the work of the organization to help the organization move toward its mission. Lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about stakeholders. So maybe there are important stakeholders who don't agree with all of our issues that we may take a position on, or think that policy work could get us away from that important direct service work that the nonprofit has been known for. And we talked about that a little bit. I gave the example of taking a position to increase tax revenues to help invest back in program services. That position makes sense to me as a board member of the Minnesota Council on Nonprofits and the work that I've done for nonprofit advocacy to then advance programs and services. But that is an important issue for a board to think about and to manage to help its donors, its constituents, its clients to understand that the board can stay true and committed to the programs and services and use policy as a way to ensure that those programs and services stay around. We have a question, and Susie's going to reflect that back for us.
Actually, we have a comment, and it is from me. There is a question from Mary Jo, which I'll save till the end. I just want to comment on the risk management question that, boards of directors are really good at risk management. They do risk management all the time. They make decisions about the financial health of the organization, about succession planning, about program direction. One of the things that I have observed is that in risk management related to public policy, any risk identified can lead to, let's not do this work. So the real opportunity here is for organizations to say to themselves, this is a risk management question, just like our fiduciary duty is, and we're going to weigh the ups and the downs of that. And we know what some of the concerns are: funding, opposition, 501c3 status, perception as being political. We can examine those things, and we can decide that the upside is better for the organization, better for the constituency we serve, and helps us achieve our mission. But we don't need to fall into the trap that because these things are a concern to us, they stop us in our tracks.
All right, great. Thanks, Susie. And like Susie noted, we did have a question come in that we'll answer in the question period at the end of the slides. I'm going to move on to talking a little bit about how some of us as board members or our board may have personal and political views that we need to manage. I'm moving on to that slide, but my slide isn't advancing. So I'm gonna keep going and talking a little bit. You guys follow along if you have your slides up. So I'm moving on from boards have a risk management job to the slide, boards of directors have diverse personal and political views. So yes, they do. We all have diverse personal and political views. I hope your board members do. I know that I do. And that's okay. That's a good thing. That's why you want to have board members that have an interest in your mission from diverse points of view. It doesn't mean that you can't have an active policy agenda. It doesn't mean that you can't have that policy committee of your board do great work, even if people come at the work from different points of view. So keep in mind that diverse personal and political views are a good thing. Individual board members may not agree on specific policy questions, and that's an important thing for boards to figure out a way that they can sometimes have a difficult policy decision to make and figure out a way to manage that conversation at the board level. Just because board members may come at it and have different views, may not agree, doesn't mean that the board can't come to a position that is useful for the organization's mission. Like I was just saying, boards often govern by consensus or don't have a lot of experience with working with controversy as they have conversations at the board level. But it's a healthy thing to have a spirited debate about an issue. And the board, in my opinion, just needs to figure out a way that they have a strategic conversation, that they come back to a conversation about the mission of the organization, as they are figuring out what the important position is of the organization and how that might fit with their own personal or political views on a specific policy issue. As we've said, diverse views and voices are great for a board of directors to have. That's the way our world works. That's the way the community is. That's the way the clients or the program participants we serve are. So it's important for the board to all be committed to the mission of the organization, but that's a healthy thing for a board to come at the policy issues that may be associated with the organization's mission with diverse views and voices. As I've said, individual board members need to know that their role on the board is to remain committed to the mission. And that's an important thing for board members to figure out how to manage. If a board member's personal or political view is taking them away from the mission, then that's an important thing for the board chair, for that policy committee, the leadership to figure out how to have a conversation about that. It is the board member's responsibility, again, to stay committed to the mission of the organization and how a policy position could best advance that mission. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about process. I mentioned that it's important for a nonprofit board of directors organization to figure out the best ways to respect those diverse views while still staying focused on the mission of the organization and how this can bring the best outcomes to get to the organization's mission. And specifically how boards may have diverse personal and political views and how they can stay connected to the mission, either through having an established process or through working it out as they go, is important for the board to figure out. I'm going to turn it over to Susie because she has a specific example related to this slide.
One of the things that is can create a problem, a process problem in our organizations is when we come to these questions and we know that we have diverse political views and we don't have the structure or process to be able to allow people's views to be expressed so they know that they're heard, but then move the conversation toward why people are in the room together, which is the shared concern about mission. I want to use an example of an organization I was working with once that was dealing with a complex issue related to immigration. And we needed to figure out what our position would be on a specific issue, and we knew that among our board, which was diverse politically, economically, ethnically, it was diverse in lots of different ways, and that diversity was a real asset to the organization, but we knew that there were really strong differences of personal opinion on the particular question that we were facing. The fact is, this isn't a democracy in a board meeting. We don't just say how many yeses, how many nos, let's just decide, by a quick, easy vote, how many people come to this with whatever personal opinion, and we're going to vote that way and be done with it. We have to have a better way to focus on the mission. So in this particular organization on this question, we drew a picture on the board. I want to offer an image to you, which is a circle, and in the middle of the circle, it says mission. And everybody knows that the reason that they're in that room today is to act in the middle of the circle, which is mission. But outside the circle, we put little dots and faces and X's and for people, both the people on our board and the people that we serve and our other stakeholders and constituents. We had the super liberal people on the left. We had the super conservative people on the right. We had the people we serve somewhere in the middle. We had our funders, all around. And what we did was illustrate that our organization had the richness and the asset of lots of different points of view coming into the middle with us. We expressed each of those points of view. We let everybody say, this is how I think from where I sit in my role in the community, in my personal history and point of view and ideology. We put that out there as outside of the circle and relevant to the discussion because it reflects the broader community. And then we invited the conversation to come inside the circle, which was the thing that everybody had in common. Everybody was focused on the organization's mission, role in the community, history, expectations, and we And we had a very productive conversation there, which led to a natural position for the organization to take. But I don't think we would have gotten there without really illustrating in a very concrete way that it's real, that people begin with different personal points of view and that that's okay, and that informs the organization, and that there's a place for that. And then we need to invite people to be in their governance role, which is really about having one thing in common, and that is the mission. So I hope that illustration helps. The next thing we'll do, we've completed the content on our 3 objectives: understanding the role of the board in developing a policy plan, learning about the various structures that may be helpful to organizations, and addressing some of the common concerns in working with boards on public policy. We'd like to open it up to questions now. We just have a few minutes left. I'd like to invite you to type in any questions you have about any challenges that you've faced, any process or structures that have been successful for your board, what you expect your biggest barriers might be, what points you'd like to have illustrated with further examples, or any other issues that this has raised for you. And while you're thinking about your questions, I'd like to address one raised by Mary Jo. I think it was Amy who said several minutes ago that there is funding available for policy work. Indeed, there is, but funding this kind of work can be complicated for a variety of reasons. I'll name a couple, and then I'll invite you to tune in a month for our webinar. Sometimes funding this work is complicated because the outcomes can feel much less specific and much less on an annual timeline than other program work. We're often needing to engage in this work over a very long time period, and the outcomes are not as specific as, for example, providing 10,000 breakfast meals to kindergartners in a year. It's not that concrete, but there are ways that we can look at this work and count things along the way and make some concrete outcomes that are fundable. It also can be challenging to fund this work because there are specific limitations that some funders have to operate within that make their funding our work not impossible but complicated. So on October 30th, we'll be having our next webinar, and the topic of that discussion will be funding available for policy and advocacy work. What I'll tell you right now as a preview is that the extent to which your organization is able to raise unrestricted funds will be helpful in this work, so from individual donors or other contributors that are able to offer unrestricted funds. And foundations are savvy and knowledgeable about the importance of systems change and policy change as a critical part of the nonprofit sector, and different kinds of institutional funders have different ways that they do that. Community foundations can be a great source of support for advocacy, and we have special relationships with private foundations in this regard, which we'll explore in a month. Are there people who have other questions or comments that would help, that you'd like to offer in the last couple of minutes of this webinar? If not, we don't see any coming in at this moment. If not, I'd like to thank you for your participation and really invite you to engage in further conversation with us as your organization is exploring this work. The staff of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits is available to your organization to talk with your staff or to meet with your board. We do that often. You're welcome to invite us to be a part of addressing this question and figuring out these issues within your organization. That's very much within the scope of our work, and we're committed to seeing your organizations be successful, so we invite you to be in touch. Also, Amy is an incredible resource who, as I mentioned in the beginning, has done this work both as a staff member in various organizations, public policy director, and as a board member for the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits and other organizations. So she really sees this work from both sides, and she runs a small consulting firm, Amy Brew Consulting, and I'm sure if your board is interested in engaging a consultant to work through these issues, she'd be happy to talk to you about that. Both of our contact information is there. This is, we hope, the beginning of the conversation and not the end. I'd like to mention just one other thing, which is timely, is that my predecessor in this role at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, Marcia Avner, the previous public policy director, has written a book. Some of you may have seen it. It's called the Nonprofit Guide to Lobbying and Advocacy. And the first edition came out several years ago, and the second edition is hot off the press. So there will be an event tonight for those of you who are in the Twin Cities at 6 p.m. until 7:30. It will be a launch event for the second edition of the Nonprofit Lobbying and Advocacy Handbook. It's at Subtext Bookstore, which is in the Blair Arcade Building at the corner of Selby and Western in the Cathedral Hill neighborhood of St. Paul. Again, it's 6 to 7 p.m. tonight. The name of the bookstore is Subtext, the corner of Selby and Western in St. Paul's Cathedral Hill. We hope you consider joining us for that. Again, please consider joining us on October 30th if you'd like to hear more about funding for nonprofit advocacy, and be in touch with us if you have questions about your board's role. Thanks so much for your participation.